is how to pronounce it. Some people say Itil, some people say Itil. Itil originally stood for the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and because it stood for IT, then Itil would be the better pronunciation. Also, there is a word Itil in some parts of the world that means something different. So Itil would be the main pronunciation, and while it stands for the IT Infrastructure Library, officially by OGC policy, Itil no longer stands for the particular words, because it's really not, while it was originally about infrastructure, it really is no longer about infrastructure. It's about service management. But because the terminology, the term Itil has been really accepted globally, they didn't want to do away with that term. So currently, Itil it's a registered trademark of the OGC, and it's just referred to as Itil. Itil is a framework of IT service management best practices originating from a study funded by the UK government in the late 1980s. The Itil is a framework. Itil is not a process model. There is no actual process model within Itil, but it's a structure, an outline, a rough overview of the processes involved in service management. So it's a framework of IT service management best practices. Itil is really focused on best practices. It was developed by incorporating public and private sector best practices. The focus there is on both of those words, best and practice. In the library, what you'll find is narrative and documentation on what is the best way to do these various capabilities and disciplines involved in service management. And while the focus is on best practice, it's not on a maturity model. Itil is not a capability maturity model like CMM or the different types of capability maturity models that are in the market or that IBM has for the process reference model for IT or for the capability maturity model that we have for Itil. A capability maturity model indicates a progression and improvement of capability over time. And Itil is not focused on the progression and improvement over time, but on what is the best practice. And as far as practice, the concept in Itil is the Itil perspective on this is that it is based on practices. What is happening in the industry, what's happening in public and private sector, what's the best way being observed currently in the market. Now, while in theory this is all about practical or in practice or actual implementations being observed, some of the content in reality is, or at least was originally written in a kind of visionary or theoretical way. And while it was originally written in that way, not more than a few years later, it's because the industry has changed and moved on, some of the concepts that were originally visionary are now accepted as pretty standard or routine best practices, while there's other concepts in the library that were visionary when they wrote them and really currently still are. In fact, the industry is really working to improve some of the areas in here and moving beyond what is written in the library. But overall, it's a library of books covering best practices for service management that are accepted and adopted worldwide. IBM contributed something called the Yellow Books, or the Information Systems Management Architecture, that documented many of the best practices that we had been implementing in commercial data centers almost 30 years ago. And the process descriptions and documentation in the Yellow Books was a primary input and basis for much of the content of version 1 of the library. Some of it was literally cut and paste. If you have both sets of books, you can see a high degree of similarity in much of the content. So fundamentally, what is Itil? Itil is a library of books. It's a library of books that document industry-accepted best practices for IT service, infrastructure, and application management. It's considered a de facto standard in the area of service management. But when you start talking about words like standard, you have to be careful, because Itil is not a standard. It's a framework. Standards, you get into a discussion about ISO and BS standards and AS standards in Australia. So this is not a standard. It is a framework, and standards is a different discussion. Itil is a library of books that document industry-accepted best practices for IT service infrastructure and application management. On slide 4, you see a graphic of what many of the books in version 2 of the library look like. You see the books planning to implement, service support, service delivery. These books are available in basically the pages are like letter size in the U.S. or probably A4 in Europe. And you can also get the content of these books on CD. IBM has provides access to all the content of these books online. And later on in this presentation, there will be information on how to access that information. But fundamentally, this is a library of books, and the content of these books is focused on best practices for service management. And when people say, I want to implement Itil, the short answer would be to buy the CDs and install them onto your network, because that would be truly implementing Itil. Itil covers a variety of subjects, some in great depth, some at a high level, but it covers a great many subjects dealing with IT management from a service management perspective. On slide 5, we see the history of Itil in a nutshell. The genesis of Itil, it began, the British government asked the CCTA to structure the IT organizations of the British government agencies according to best practices. And of course, the people on that commission, one of the first things that they wanted to find out what are the best practices? What is the best way to align IT with business objectives, to lower the cost of service delivery, and improve the quality of services? So the original intent of this library was to document the answers to those questions. What are the best practices? And the best practice meaning what's the best way to achieve those specific desired objectives that we have in our environment? How do we lower the cost of managing and delivering services in our environment? What's the best way to improve the quality of services? And if a client asks the question, we would like to lower costs, improve quality, achieve specific objectives through IT, one answer is that you could come and talk to them about the results of a study that were performed on just that question. What are the best practices? Because the results of that study were published in a library of books. The original library was 40-plus books, and they were called the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. Shortly after those books were published, a user group was formed called ITSMF, IT Service Management Forum. And the IT Service Management Forum is focused on IT service management best practices and getting companies, vendors together, and vendors to get together and to discuss real-life experience with the implementation of best practices. So that one person could talk to another, what's your experience with implementing change management? How did you handle the authority level of the change manager? What is your experience with a configuration management database? Is it federated? Do you really have one, or do you really have more than one? Since that time, since the publication of version 1 of the library, many of the books have been revised and consolidated into version 2 of the library. Version 2 was published between 2000 and 2004. The first books were published in 2000, and the most recent book in version 2 of the library was published at the end of 2004, in late November. Version 2 of the Itil framework consists of a consolidated library of books on service management best practices. And while there are many books in this library, there is only one subject, and the subject of Itil is IT service management best practices. And it covers IT service management best practices in various disciplines within IT. Many companies are unfamiliar with IBM's